What? It had to happen eventually. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Matmos, The Consuming Flame, Open Exercises in Group Form. Okay, Matmos, Drew Daniel and MC Schmidt. This is now my third time covering these guys. I've already highlighted them as one of the most interesting and creative projects in all of electronic music. A sample-based outfit that takes from the most unlikely of sources and ends up with some fittingly super off-the-wall material, be it making a whole album out of sounds from household objects, or surgery, or a washing machine, or plastic things. I will admit that my personal connection to their music doesn't run as deep as I'd like. While I will always be wowed by their sound design and creativity, I've always felt like the music itself can be a little on the inaccessible side, and feel like they don't put as much effort into crafting the actual tunes as they do just getting it to sound super outlandish and unlike anything you've ever heard before. Now mind you, it's not like there's no effort in that department at all. All of their albums are still definitely musical to some degree, in a way that I don't think anyone can really deny, but only a select few of their projects have really connected with me and stuck with me long term. One of the ones that did was their previous project from last year, Plastic Anniversary, which I still hold up as my personal favorite of their projects overall, because it had both their really outlandish sound design and really creative concept, but also really got the music itself to come together in a way that connected with me. It was a ton of fun, and ended up fairly high on my year-end list. But that brings us to this latest project, The Consuming Flame. I do always look forward to hearing a new project from these guys, whether I'm likely to really enjoy it or not, and the concept this time around is that they've worked with 99 different collaborators from all manner of backgrounds, be it more well-known names that get featuring credits like Clipping and Mouse on Mars and Yola Tango and One O Tricks Point Never, or from what I've heard, also writers and some of MC Schmidt's students in like a sound design class that he teaches or something. Citation needed. Whoever they happen to hit up, they could contribute whatever the hell they wanted, so long as the tempo was set at 99 beats per minute. Any genre, any sound, literally anything goes with this one. It's their meatiest and most ambitious project to date in a decades-long career full of ambitious concepts, and boy do they not hold back on anything here. There is just one little problem that I'm sure really took people aback the second they looked it up. This project is 3 hours long. It's a triple album, 3 discs. And I have a feeling a bunch of people were like, oh boy, Matmos are dropping singles, teasing a new project. I can't wait to hear how weird and outlandish it is. Holy shit, 3 hours. Never mind, can't be bothered to sit through that. I mean, that was actually pretty close to my own thought process. Though given I have reviewed much longer and more grueling projects than this, I figured that really isn't a good excuse for me to just skip over this entirely. I mean, one of my current frontrunners for Album of the Year is a triple album as well. What's one more to look into? I mean, even Fantano didn't skip over this one, and he gave it the yellow flannel and everything. I certainly wasn't expecting this to be an easy listen, but I figured I should be giving it a fair shot. I've now listened to it like 3-4 times in full. It was pretty difficult to nail down how I even felt about this. But yeah, the way I feel right now is, as a whole, I don't think I was into it as Fantano was, but yeah, I still generally enjoyed it. As is the case with most Matmos projects, the wild sound design and insane variety is the big star of the show here, and emotional resonance maybe not so much. But still undoubtedly they had plenty of great moments scattered all throughout. For some of you, I imagine this is just not going to be worth the trouble to sit through. I mean, 3-hour project that requires multiple sittings to really wrap your head around. It is quite a commitment, to say the least. But yeah, I mean, given there's a decent chunk of my audience who has given me shit for thinking Outakre's NTS sessions were way too long, I imagine there'll be plenty more people for whom the length will not at all be a problem. All depends on your tastes, I suppose. Personally, I definitely did not love this project all the way through. I thought it could be a little inconsistent, but I agree with Fantano's take that each progressive disc of the album is better than the one before it. Disc 1, A Doughnut In The Sky, is alright. Disc 2, On The Team, is pretty solid. And Disc 3, eXtRaTeRrEsTrIaL Masters, is properly great, I think. And as I mentioned, repeat visits help a lot too. First listen, I was really feeling that length, but it became less and less of a drag the more I came back to it. Marginally, it's still kind of, it's still a lot. So, Are we ready to break down this behemoth? Let's go. Starting out with Disc 1, A Doughnut in the Sky, the weakest of the three. Not because I think it's any less cohesive or less well constructed than the other two, it does flow together really nicely in the same way that the other discs do, and get these pieces to complement each other and feel like they belong together despite kind of meandering wherever the hell it wants and occasionally just totally abruptly switching up genre without warning. All three discs do that. This disc I just found to be the least interesting of the three. The opening few moments of Cold Open, iVoxelman, and Moat Swarm form a fairly abstract and sparse set of IDM experimentations. Not a lot of melody involved here. Cold Open does have some drill sounds and weird squeaky saxophones in the background. iVoxelman has some more melodic synths, but also these weird squeaky processed voices that got on my nerves. And Moat Swarm directly built off the previous track in such a way that I often didn't even notice it was a different track at all. These opening moments are no more or less indicative than anything else here. There's really no good way to set yourself up for what you're about to hear, but I wouldn't really say we're starting off on the strongest or most compelling of moments here. The first track that's really stuck out to me as the standout was Adam's Apple. This big, crashing and noisy psychedelic rock digression that just abruptly slams through the previous mix and wakes you up. All these banging drums and guitars going up against reverse drums and weird little squeaking analog synth excursions in just that perfect 60s throwback kind of way. That was great. But then that leads into Athens' New Guinea Gas Can Japan, which has some totally detuned, plucked string instrument going up against formless acoustic guitar grooves and weird tape manipulations, and later this kind of jazzy acoustic drum beat plodding along underneath that comes back in a whole bunch of different tracks. Not to mention digressions into field recordings and what sounds like scraping a shovel against concrete. Any sense of form or groove went out the window here, and much of this disc kind of has that sense of total formlessness, and it feels like there's a lot of empty negative space. The following track, Thyrsus, that's another highlight with its cute little experimental synth tune that has these echoing voice snippets pitched up and down, forming a pretty good melody alongside some well-textured acoustic percussion and bass lines. Sounds really nice, even though it takes a little bit to get there. Makes me feel like I'm in the middle of a jungle somewhere, and the bird sounds later on help too. And it leads into Circle of Swords, featuring Clipping, another mostly formless piece, but still containing a solid pulse and a lot of various passages of stuttered vocal snippets chopped up into lots of tiny pieces, and that sample from some kind of religious ritual later on going up against more jazzy beats and weird out-of-tune flute riffs. That one's pretty cool too. And after a pleasant but mostly unremarkable steel drum ditty in Virgin Unspotted, which just builds right off the same grooves the previous track had, we then get No Concept, which does build this really cool IDM groove with plenty of bassy rumbling and tension built, though it also has these noises that sound like this abrasive squeaking on glass that just makes me reflexively tense up every time. I really do not like that. Also, there's just a random moment where the groove stops entirely to make way for all these crashing noises, like all the machines used to make the groove just fell apart in a random heap, and then it just kind of picks up like that didn't even happen right after that. I wanted to say I like this track more than I do, just those freaking squeaking glass sounds are way too much of a turnoff. Thankfully, some of these ideas are explored in a much more compelling way on In the Shape of Beasts, which kind of has two halves, with its first half that has like all these banging tribal war drums and buzzing electronic digressions, and its second half being a lot spookier and more low-key and formless with bassy rumbling ambience and a few sparse layers of dissonant piano plinking. All very nice, but unfortunately that was the last track on this disc of the project that really stuck out to me as a major standout. Revelatory Mint Clot, with all its plucking synth guitars and processed NASA announcers and various plunky percussion textures, it's cool, I guess, but more often than not just passes me by and blends in the background. Western Clot Rider, with its synthesized male choruses and many interjecting vocal snippets, one of which name drops this disc's title. That one is easier to recognize when it comes up, though I wouldn't call it a particular favorite either. There is one more track that was very close to being a favorite, but I wasn't really sure, with Cocktail Party How Glad Am I? Which has all these really nice, like, smooth jazz passages with electric pianos and flutes and everything, though later also a large crowd of text-to-speech voices that slowly consumes the mix of the track, starting out fairly innocent, but you just hear them increasingly getting louder and more vulgar and angry and sarcastic, like the text-to-speech voice guy I use on this channel would fit right alongside these people. This track is really creatively executed and sounds really nice, but boy are those text-to-speech voices really pissy, and not in a way that I feel is a positive addition to the track. They add like this weirdly sour vibe, like everyone in this room absolutely hates each other, and it just creates this really uncomfortable tension, like if I was at one of our family get-togethers and some of my aunts and uncles decided this would be a good time to argue about politics. That ends well, usually. But at least those voices were barely audible in a crowd of other voices on that track. What follows in the disc's closer, I'm Fine, is more of those text-to-speech voices directly lifted from the previous track, but isolated so that you can hear exactly what they say in their incoherent pissiness. For instance, repeatedly saying, I'm on the team! I'm on the team! And that text-to-speech setting just making it sound totally sarcastic and like they just completely hate their life. All over a jokey instrumental of bass clarinets and really awful out-of-tune yodeling. It feels like I'm in the middle of some terrible clown show being made fun of and insulted and patronized for having tried to take anything on this album seriously. It's the musical equivalent of saying, it's all just a prank, bro! And I absolutely fucking hated it. Easily the worst track on any of the 3 discs by a long shot. And again, on the physical version, that track's the disc's closer, which, boy, way to close a disc than by completely removing any sense of dignity the album might have had before. On the version I heard, though, there is one more track called Verminiatures, which is like this formless cascade of synths and IDM percussion, which at least ends the disc on a forgettable moment rather than an outright terrible one. Though, on the physical version, that one ends up near the end of disc 2, and I get the feeling that it was originally supposed to be there. Here it feels kind of more like a tacked-on bonus track or something. I don't know. But yeah, that's the Doughnut in the Sky. It has its moments that really work, and the flow from track to track, all genre shifts aside, is consistently really seamless and well done. Though a lot of the actual music can feel a little empty and dull and meandering aimlessly compared to the other 2 discs where the ideas have more definition and identity. And Jesus Christ, this disc's endings suck. I won't act like I didn't enjoy myself at all for this one. I'm Fine is the only outright bad moment in this entire package, and there's tons of attention to detail and cool sounds to explore throughout every moment. I think the other 2 discs explore a lot more musically compelling and better structured ideas than this one does. It's not nearly as strong by comparison. By itself, A Doughnut in the Sky is a 6.5 out of 10. So then that brings us to disc 2, On the Team. So its intro is Adepts. That's not a way better opener than the first disc's opening moments, though it is a better start. It's got out-of-tune acoustic plucks, vocal snippets in another language I don't recognize, plinky synths and thumping percussion, and even some spooky organs near the end. It does have a nice build to it and a cool, exotic, and otherworldly feel to its experimentalism. Then after an interlude of incomprehensible vocal stuttering and maybeism, we then make it to Garden of Tall Boys, another cool little interlude of chill, maybe kalimba and guitar and Asian harp plucking over a neat little airy synth string pad. Did very much enjoy the nice little laid-back vibes that one created. And then Dancing Your Animal has all these honking and squeaking clarinets and saxophones going up against one of the beats from disc 1, and lots of bleeping synth textures. These elements don't really coalesce together in any way, but that also kind of feels intentional, so But then we get to Nice Men in Stable Relationships, another track I really wanted to like more than I do, but I don't know, felt weirdly shallow. The trap beat does bang pretty nicely, and there's these almost operatic vocals repeatedly yelping out the title, Nice Men in Stable Relationships, while joined by weird sound effects and lots of samples from various external sources saying the word nice. I got 2 problems with this one. First of all, the singing does not really feel like it fits with the instrumental. It's probably too good for this track, which is otherwise being played for a joke. And secondly, someone actually decided to sample Michael Rosen saying nice on this one twice. This probably isn't gonna matter to most people, but as someone who has been, involved in the Michael Rosen YTP community for the past 7 years, all that clip did for me was make me think, that's way too obvious and on the nose. Couldn't you have picked something more obscure that hasn't been completely played out? Especially since you're on a Matmos album, for crying out loud, an outfit whose main appeal is their weirdness and creativity. Really could have stood to try harder than that. At least that whole sidetrack into 80s guitars was fun, though. Anyway, moving on. Oh, we got another spooky interlude in Let Us In, mostly forgettable. But then there's Friendsylum. That was another highlight. Just a simple little drum machine beat and plinky, minimalistic synth melodies. Fairly low-key stuff, but it certainly does its job well. A little Pilot Red Sun-ish, I guess. I don't know. Then we get Io, Lavendar, River Karez with Yola Tango. Completely ambient piece that just kind of meanders around into various different nostalgic synth pads. Didn't stick out to me a ton, but once again certainly does well for what it is. This nice long stretch of warm and comfy ambience is as welcome as anything else here. And that leads into The Void at the center, the direct midpoint of the album if I'm not mistaken, at least on the physical version. I did quite like this one's mix of like subtle thumping ambient techno with tired sounding voice stuttering, and some off-kilter plunking melodies that come in halfway really raise this track into being a highlight. From there we have I Know What I Saw, which has some more synthesized voices that directly references the titles of the other two discs on the album, over more spooky experimental beats and squeaky horns echoing out in the distance. And then Sarabande with all its cascades of synths and guitars, plucking lots of individual notes and arpeggios, meandering around, and at one point switching over to this beat made out of what sounds like a lot of banging on dumpsters. That one's fun, though it would often pass me by without me noticing. But then that leads into The Dead City of Telphar, which for the most part is just as cool as that title sounds. All these whirring analog synths creating this really haunting and intensely deserted vibe, a la like some old 70s synth pioneer work. And the second half with all the fuzzy sounds that sound like you're switching through FM radio stations at high speed. It doesn't add a lot to that atmosphere, but it's cool too. And that leads into Platformalism, which I guess is kind of like if I'm Fine had a point and wasn't insulting. All the text-to-speech voices making all this, like, meta-commentary satire on technology reliance with its disconnected references to My Little Netflix and social media and don't talk about politics and repeatedly sampling the HBO stinger. I'd be lying if I said I loved this track or even particularly looked forward to it. I mean, again, it just feels like a total joke track that makes me feel like I'm reading Twitter even when I'm not reading Twitter. And god, the fake text-to-speech laughing could really do without that. Ha 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 ha. Ha 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 ha. But there is still a more creative idea behind this one, and its feeling of vapid superficiality does feel like it was actually serving a purpose. I guess it does its job, I don't know. Then we wind down the project with Reciprocal Realms, a stuttered and glitched up chorus of indie singers, then a minute-long interlude in Unmastering that somehow still stuck out to me as a highlight with all its dark drum and bass excursions. And finally, I'm on the Team with Giant Swan, Rabbit, and Max Tundra, which is totally forgettable. Got a lot of low-key voices saying the title and being stuttered and glitched up, and some other sounds, I guess, but kind of an underwhelming finish. Still, this disc was a lot more fun to listen to than the first. Ran around into a lot more interesting and compelling ideas. I do have a lot of the same issues with this disc that I do to disc 1. It's not as sparse, but a lot of ideas can pass me by without leaving a strong impression, and the ideas don't always feel like they directly build into each other or complement each other that well. I think more so this one than on disc 1. Just feels like everything's being made up as we go along. But, I mean, it's generally more consistent and definitely more all-around rewarding experience than the first disc. I think disc 2 by itself, I'll give like a 7.5 out of 10. But finally, that brings us to the final and strongest of the 3 discs, eXtRaTeRrEsTrIaL Masters. By this point, I usually take a break before getting to this disc, because, like, this project really becomes an exhausting listen if you try to get through all of it in one sitting. I would not recommend doing that. But this is easily the disc that has the strongest opening. Blessed Order of is this fuzzy and glitchy ambient piece made up of all these blocky synth pads with this post-apocalyptic sort of symphonic flair to them, and all these rocky bursts of noise. Kind of like if a Tim Hecker track had a beat and a groove. It's a really dramatic and attention-grabbing start. Floaters feels like an interlude despite being 3 minutes. All these airy synth voice snippets over some water sound effects and maybe clavinets. Not as dramatic as the opener, but still feels like it carries some of the vibe and sense of environment over. And then suddenly we get into Goodnight loving Bose Ikard. which has this sort of Wild West feeling to it, with those guitars and the whistling, despite going over a bunch of strange IDM drum machine beats. Weird blend, but comes together more effectively than you'd think. Two Rivers Run is another interlude, with lots of layers of human voices talking about where the two rivers run. Not text-to-speech this time. This track, it's there, I guess. It adds flavor, though not in a way that makes it particularly stand out. I wouldn't skip it. But then there's Boomchicka, which just sticks out just looking over the track listing since it's 13 minutes long. And it's probably the single best individual track on this whole project. Well, making use of that length and seamlessly flowing from more Wild West guitars and folk vocal harmonies into layers of constantly evolving synth arpeggios, atonal ambience with tribal percussion and laser E sounds, and then back into some of those previous ideas but with a different flair and at a different angle, like some of the guitars have more like a MIDI-ish quality to them, I don't know. And it all happens so gradually and smoothly while progressing just enough to make sure it keeps your attention the whole time. That one is freaking great. Anyways, from there we get eXtRaTeRrEsTrIaL, a spooky ambient synth excursion with more layers of arpeggios as tons of different voices say, "I am an extraterrestrial master. I am an extraterrestrial master," over and over and over. No voice, be it human or auto-generated, appears more than once, just to make sure you don't get bored. It sounds really nice, again, and I don't actually get sick of that phrase while the track is playing, but it does become more of a problem when this track does not stop showing up in the next two tracks. By the time we get to the track Out of the Serpent's Mouth, I'm just like, freaking stop saying that. That's a neat track, though. Anyway, then we get Circle of Shivers, another pretty cool interlude-ish track with whispering beatboxing, a dense and glittering percussion section, as well as several different flute textures, one of which is almost like a tornado alarm or something. It's really otherworldly and strange, but still has a solid groove to it. And it all bleeds into dark ambience and choir synths by the end, even if you can't still hear the voices from eXtRaTeRrEsTrIaL carrying over again. And then next up we got the two tracks with One of Tricks Point Never. We got Out of the Serpent's Mouth, this really strange track that has tons of side tracks from organ-like pads and more tornado alarm horns, as well as glitchy synth progressions, presumably care of Lopatin, as well as other strange, spacey, and dense ambient sections, and even a sitar drone. There is just one problem with this track. One of the side tracks brings back some of those operatic singers, and as I mentioned before, yes, they are again singing, "I am an extraterrestrial master." I mean, the singers were already kind of annoying, but the fact that they're still saying this phrase over and over, I just got really sick of it by this point. But aside from that one little part, this would otherwise be one of my favorite tracks. It just seems to combine every sound explored on this disc of the album. And we get Warm Opening, also with Lopatin, which is a much more straightforward synth excursion that has not much more to it than the layers of plinking synth progressions, waves of ambience, and a simple beat that's somewhere between IDM and hip-hop. It's nice, not a major standout though. Then after an interlude of various isolated loud noises stitched together ad nauseum in Decalcomaenads, however you say that, we then hit this album's home stretch. And we do pick up into roughly the same quality level this album started at. It isn't necessarily the case with Mouse on Mars has all these chopped up like Latin horn band samples that play all these descending progressions alongside other ringing bell sounds and later weird squeaky IDM beats. And then we got Elsewards, which is another interlude that manages to stand out as a highlight with all its synth a cappella performances. Mostly made up of that, like, MIDI keyboard sound that sounds like someone saying do 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 do. As well as other quirky electronic bleeping and whirring around that becomes more melodic and present as the track goes along. It's actually really cool. And then finally we get to our big grand finale, All of the Powers Lie Quiet, which, unlike the endings of the other two discs, is thankfully a properly satisfying finish as well. Well, at first it just kind of meanders around atonal synths and beats and voice snippets, but some of those haunting and deserted vintage synth lines come in for that special sense of intensity, and the beats switch over into a slower and bouncier pattern and finally bleed into these emotional bedroom pop ambient pads, and it slowly closes out with two longer vocal snippets at the very end. Maybe dragged out that little bit at the very end a bit long. There's like even a little glitchy fake ending or something, but it does hit the right emotional note I'd want out of an ending. Again, more than I can say for the other two discs. I gotta say, if absolutely nothing else, Disc 3 is the reason to check out this album. If you're intimidated by the length of this project, you can probably just skip over the first 2 discs and get right to this one. It feels like a perfectly well-realized album in its own right. It's the only one with a particularly strong start or strong finish, let alone both. And there's a palpable sense of environment formed here that the other 2 discs are too scattershot to pull off effectively. It even flows better as a full piece, even if the other 2 discs also flowed really well. eXtRaTeRrEsTrIaL Masters, it may beat its title into the ground, but aside from that is an excellent ambient experimental journey, and by itself I'm feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on it. So, final thoughts on the Consuming Flame as a whole. I don't know how much I'm going to be returning this project in the future. Admittedly, I can't bring myself to think of these 3 discs as a single project to be listened to holistically. Even if it was clearly designed that way, they were all created under the same approach and concept, but they vary too much in quality for me to want to keep all of them. I'm probably just hanging on to disc 3 and that'll be it. Disc 1 and 2 have lots of really good moments all throughout, and even the worst moments have tons of dense and layered sound design that any experimental music fan will be able to fully appreciate. Like I said earlier in this video, I'm sure there will be people here who have no problem with the length, and just want to soak up the sheer density and variety. This is definitely the densest, most varied, and most ambitious Matmos album to date by a noticeable length, and that should really be saying something. It is truly a mind-breaking listen in every way. That said, it is also mind-breaking in the challenging-to-get-through sense. I can't bring myself to go through this whole thing in one sitting, I just can't. The first 2/3 are too scattershot and inconsistent. Not to mention, obviously, this much Matmos all at once truly is just an exhausting ordeal. These guys may be on a level of creative that no other artist out there can attest to, but Christ, 3 fucking hours of Matmos really does wipe you out. Admirable that they captured my interest as much as they did, and again, got better and more consistent the further into the album you got. Not usually how that works. But I have absolutely no desire to listen to the full 3 hours again once this video goes up. Still, if the length doesn't sound like that big a commitment to you and this kind of stuff is up your alley, absolutely make sure you pick it up. You will have your mind completely blown. If it looks interesting but you don't want to sit through all 3 hours, I'd recommend sitting through just disc 3 and skipping over the rest, and maybe come back to the other 2 if you really loved disc 3 enough. And if you've never been a fan of Matmos to begin with, obviously stay far away. If you've never heard any Matmos album, do not start here. Do not freaking start here. Start with A Chance to Cut is a Chance to Cure, or Plastic Anniversary, or Ultimate Care 2, or I don't know. Me personally, all my many issues aside, I'm still glad I sat down with it and gave it as much time as I did. There's a lot of great stuff here. And yeah, I don't feel like rating the full package under 1 score. Alright, and that's it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
In ways that bring distress with